In this lesson, we'll be learning about nematode examples. So here's our nematode, our roundworm. Over 25,000 species of nematodes have been described, and over half of those species are described as parasitic. And what a parasite is when one organism harms another organism. And in this case, the nematodes harm other organisms, and the nematodes benefit. They get food, they get nutrients, they get a place to live, while they harm the other organisms. Now, they don't kill the other organisms because they want to be able to keep feeding off the other organisms. So they do harm, they take away nutrients, but they don't kill them. So nematodes that are parasitic can infect animals, they can infect plants. And in fact, this scientist named Nathan Cobb says that if we took away all matter in the universe except for nematodes, our world would be still dimly recognizable. We should find its mountains, hills, valleys, rivers, lakes, and oceans represented by a film of nematodes. Towns would be decipherable, since for every massing of human beings there would be a corresponding massing of certain nematodes. Trees would stand in ghostly roads representing our streets and highways. The location of the various plants and animals would still be decipherable, and had we sufficient knowledge, in many cases even their species could be determined by an examination of their erstwhile nematode parasites. So what Nathan Cobb said is nematodes infect almost everything. And so the animals, the trees, the plants, we could see that these ghost-like apparitions would be there because they're covered in nematodes. And there are nematodes that are not parasitic that live in the soil, so we would still be able to see the mountains and the hills, and in the water, the lakes and the oceans. So nematodes are everywhere. Some of them are not parasitic, they live in the soil. We're not bothered by them, but some of them are parasitic, and those are the examples we're going to be learning about in this lesson, especially because they're probably the most interesting. So the first one we're going to learn about is genus Trichinella. So Trichinella is a roundworm, and it causes the disease trichinosis. So in this picture, this is the roundworm all curled up in a little cyst, and we'll talk about its life cycle in just a second. But trichinosis is a parasitic disease caused by eating undercooked pork or wild game that is infected by the nematode. So what happens is we eat undercooked meat, pork, or wild game, and so it's undercooked, and the meat isn't hot enough to have killed the parasite. So we ingest this parasite, it goes into our intestines, and there proceeds to have a bunch of babies. And these babies they're small enough, they slip out of the intestine and can travel in the bloodstream. And they can travel to the heart and the brain, which can cause brain damage or heart failure. But most often they just travel to muscles. And so they exit the bloodstream and bury themselves into the muscles and stay there. And then there they are in the muscle. So that's what happens if you're human. Now, how do pigs get it, for example? Pigs will eat some undercooked meat. They'll get the worms that will travel into their muscles, and then the pigs are butchered and we eat them, and if we eat them undercooked, then the parasite lives and can travel to our muscles. Some symptoms of trichinosis include diarrhea, abdominal pain and vomiting, fever, and muscle pain and tenderness. And this is because those worms bury into our muscles and cause those little cysts that can cause pain and tenderness. Swelling around the eyes is also a symptom because the worms are traveling there. So you can see in this picture that there's some swelling around the eyes where the worms are located, and so that's also a symptom of trichinosis. Now, how we prevent trichinosis is we cook all pork and wild game products thoroughly. So we need to kill the Trichinella worm. So we need to make sure that pork and wild game, so that's deer, elk, anything that we catch out in the wild, needs to be cooked thoroughly to the appropriate temperature so we kill the trichinosis worm. The next example we're going to be learning about is genus Ascaris. Here's a picture of an ascarid worm or an Ascaris worm, and the genus Ascaris causes the disease Ascariasis. Ascariasis is a parasitic disease caused by ingesting ascarid eggs deposited in the feces of infected people or animals. So here's the life cycle of the ascarid worm. What happens is the eggs get passed in some stool, either out of infected animals or of humans, and they mature in the soil, and then we ingest them, and they're in our intestine. The larvae are small enough that they can break through the intestinal wall, and they travel up into the lungs, where they crawl up the windpipe, back down, and into the stomach. And then they mature in the intestine and then are passed out in the stool. So this is the life cycle of the ascarid worm. Probably the most interesting fact is that they do crawl up to the lungs, and then they crawl up the throat where we cough them, or where we swallow them back down into the stomach. So this is a picture. Hopefully it's not too disturbing. I try not to pick too disturbing of images, but these are the ascarid worms that have traveled up the throat from the lungs and are protruding out of the mouth of this child. Now this next picture is kind of a little intense, so prepare yourself. This is a pig intestine, and the ascarid worms have reproduced so much within the intestine that they're blocking the intestine of this pig, and that's how this pig died. But you can see just lots and lots of worms inside the intestine. So some symptoms of ascariasis. Often people don't show symptoms. An estimated 1 billion people worldwide are infected. That's 1 in 7 people, and that's pretty high if you think about it. It's not a common infection in the United States, but it is present. People often have light abdominal pain. They have a cough due to the migration of the worms through the body. So when the worms move from the lungs up the throat, that causes a cough, and we cough them up and then we swallow them back down into our stomach. And intestinal blockage can also be a symptom. So how do we prevent ascariasis? Avoid ingesting soil that may be contaminated by human feces. And you may think, I don't eat food that's been contaminated by human feces. But if we import a lot of our produce, and a lot of that produce is in countries that may not have the best sewer systems. So it's always important to wash raw fruits and vegetables thoroughly before eating them, if you're going to eat them raw, or cook them completely. And also proper hand washing before eating and while handling food is important. So the next example of a nematode is filarial worms. They're in superfamily Filarioidea, but you can just know the name filarial worms. Filarial worms cause the disease elephantiasis, and you'll see why in just a minute. Elephantiasis is a parasitic disease caused by a bite by an infected mosquito. So here's the life cycle. What happens is the mosquito bites an infected human and sucks up the larva that's in the bloodstream, and then it matures in the mosquito, and the mosquito will bite another human, and it injects the larva into that human, and now that human has filarial worms in their bloodstream. And these filarial worms are little, and they can move through the bloodstream and through the lymphatic system, and can cause problems. And that's their life cycle. Then they'll get sucked up by another mosquito, and the cycle continues. So the reason this disease is called elephantiasis is because when these worms get stuck in the lymphatic system, it causes the lymph nodes to swell and can cause the swelling of appendages that often make legs look like elephant legs. So they're really thick and stocky. Symptoms of elephantiasis include edema, which is a fancy word for swelling, and this occurs when the worms get stuck in the lymphatic system. So swelling and enlarging of arms, legs, and other body parts is common in elephantiasis. Also, a thickening of the skin can occur. How do we prevent elephantiasis? You cannot get infected in the United States. Only the tropical and subtropical areas are affected. But if you ever go, you want to avoid mosquito bites, and you can sleep under a mosquito net and wear long sleeves and pants, and of course, an insect repellent would also be helpful. Our last nematode example are hookworms. Hookworms cause a hookworm infection. So this is a hookworm. This is under the microscope, and this is its head enlarged. You can see it has looks like sharp teeth. They're not teeth like we know it, but they cause an infection, and it's caused by walking barefoot on infected soil. So what happens is the worm enters through bare feet, crawls up through the lungs, so just like the ascarid worm, goes up through the throat, we cough it back down into our stomach, and we pass it out when we make a bowel movement. So then the eggs mature in the soil and the feces that were pooped out, and then when the worm grows up, it enters another foot and the cycle begins again. So this is a picture of a hookworm infection. The hookworm sometimes can make very obvious trails as it crawls up the foot. So here's a picture of these little hookworms. They don't look too dangerous, but they can cause those paths we saw through the skin. Here's another picture. The hookworms need to travel up, so you'll see the paths moving up the leg. So symptoms of a hookworm infection, often people don't have any symptoms. Blood loss can occur, but sometimes obvious paths can be seen under the skin. How do we prevent hookworm infections? Avoid walking barefoot on soil that may be contaminated by human feces. Again, maybe not so much a problem here in the U.S., but in other countries, you always want to wear shoes. And don't lay on the soil either. Avoid other skin contact. And avoid ingesting soil that may be infected by hookworms. So those are our 4 examples of nematodes that you need to know.